That doesn't seem such a big deal anymore. It's always a mystery, and who knows, but it's not this, big, mysterious black thing, because when it comes up from up close, and he came very close a couple of times, he was walking on the edge. Essentially, what you see in death is really your own face. You realize that in death you're going to be what your experience is. And, it's as basic as that. So, who knows how after you die? But at least it's a very interesting insight. That death really is a mirror. Whatever you see is your own state of mind, your own state of presence, not more, nor less. Surprise, surprise.
So it's a real honor and privilege for me to be here and to particularly speak after this amazing gathering of the talks that we've heard, and also listening to Francisco. And this is a picture from the film the clip that we just saw, and one of my favorite pictures of Francisco, and it's with a deep sense of gratitude and honoring his extraordinary contributions. And John and I were just talking, and he actually was really just hitting his stride with a whole program of research in humans that was just beginning when his life so prematurely ended. And it's heartening to see the development of contemplative neuroscience that very much has been inspired by Francisco. So I'm going to start this presentation with a bit of a humility induction, and this is a counterpoint and complement to what we saw in Adam's talk, although at a very different level of scale. So you can meditate on this, and I will describe as we're going along. This is a journey through 1 cubic millimeter of cortex. 1 cubic millimeter. These are apical dendrites. I'll say that after. The box in the left-hand corner indicates what level of cortex is being displayed. It's descending. They are different kinds of neurons and glial cells. They're labeling different cells with different properties. And the green is the very long axons, some of which descend all the way down to the toes. Just all different kinds of cells. It's labeling different chemical properties. Some of them are glutamatergic, others are GABAergic. Some of them are short interneurons, others are long neurons. The what?
The large globe that's on the end of some of those?
Those are synaptic boutons. The white matter is the parts where there are axonal connections that show up as white matter. Here they're labeled as green. This is now going below cortex. Okay, 1 millimeter of cortex, 1 cubic millimeter. So to think that we can actually understand anything about the brain by putting an electrode on the head or by putting a person in an MRI scanner is really kind of ludicrous and unthinkable. And so this really is, I think, something that is important to rub our noses in and just appreciate in whatever ways we can the really extraordinary complexity. From everything we know, this is the most complex piece of matter in the universe. But who knows? There may be others in other solar systems, but for what we know right now, it is. So I want to start with a few inspirational photographs. This was taken in 2001 when His Holiness the Dalai Lama visited our lab. He's been actually to Madison 16 times since he's been in exile, which is quite remarkable and an honor for our city. And here we were showing him the crude techniques that we have to work with. And actually there was a really interesting story when he came to visit on this occasion. We had one of my students lying in the MRI scanner, and I told him, just lay there. We'll eventually get to the MRI suite. We wanted to demonstrate to His Holiness the Dalai Lama how functional MRI works. This was in 2001. It was still the early days of these techniques. And so we decided to use a very tried and true method that we can illustrate in real time. And what we did is we simply asked the student to please move the fingers in his left hand, which is controlled by the right motor cortex, and then to move the fingers in the right hand, which are controlled by the left motor cortex. And we were able to look in real time at the activation patterns in MRI to see how the activation patterns change. And you can see this visually. You don't need any sophisticated signal processing to detect it. It's very visible. So we asked the student to do that. We can see his hands through the window into the MRI. And sure enough, we observed what has been observed thousands of times, and we saw the activation. And then after we showed this to His Holiness said, "Can I please ask him to do something?" And of course we said, yes. And so he asked the student to please imagine moving his hands, but don't actually move them. And this was an amazing question, one that had been asked before, but His Holiness is like the dream graduate student, asking really amazing questions. And we asked him to do this, and sure enough, we saw that there are patterns of brain activity when he was not moving his fingers that in many ways, not fully, but in many aspects, resembled the patterns that were observed when his fingers were actually moving. And this was a very important demonstration, I think, for His Holiness to see that we can actually detect signals in the brain that were associated with mental activity, with pure mental activity. This is just a devotional picture. This was actually taken by Mathieu Ricard, and some of you recognize some of the people in this picture. That's Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, and that's Mingyur Rinpoche when he was 8 years old, being held by his mom at the feet of Khyentse Rinpoche. And just envision an upbringing like this and the impact that it has on the mind and the brain. So fast forward to 1992, and this is a group of us, including Francisco Varela, who were schlepping 5,000 pounds of equipment in the hills, Baksu Mountain, just outside of Dharamsala, where we naively thought that we were going to launch contemplative neuroscience in its modern form. And so we brought all this equipment. We had Sherpas helping us carry the equipment in backpacks up to caves and huts where long-term meditators were spending most of the remainder of their life in semi-retreat. And we thought we would be able to start our data collection on this visit. And that was a very naive assumption, a very big bust. Cliff Sarin was with us on this occasion, as was Alan Wallace. And I had mentioned, I think earlier, one evening when we were there, His Holiness asked us to please give a talk to the monks at the Nyamgal Monastery about what we were doing, and we decided to give a demonstration. Oh, this is in one of the caves, actually, with one of the practitioners, where we were trying to collect data and videotape. And for many of these practitioners, it was the very first time, this was in 1992, it was the very first time they had ever seen a computer. And so, let alone touch a computer. And so it was very formidable to navigate this cultural divide, and we were not able to collect any real data on this visit. But this is when we were getting set up to give a demonstration and showing His Holiness how the equipment worked. And that's actually Francisco just next to His Holiness in this picture. And Alan Wallace is just next to Francisco. And then fast forward to 2001, and this is Mingyur Rinpoche for the first time in our lab, meditating and really beginning the start of this project of contemplative neuroscience. John Dunn was very much a part of this, and in fact, this was around the time when John and I first met. John was on the faculty as an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin in Buddhist Studies, and John actually helped translate for many of the practitioners when they came. And this was work that was initiated by Antoine Lutz, who was Francisco's last graduate student, who came in Francisco's place at that meeting in April of 2001 when Francisco wasn't able to make it, and then Antoine stayed for the next 10 years after that. And then fast forward to, I think this was 2000, someone help me, 13 or 14. This was the very first, 13, this was the very first Mind and Life meeting that was held in a monastery. This was in the Drepung Monastery in the south of India. And this is the group of speakers who were present at that meeting. Some of you, I'm sure, recognize some of the people. Mathieu Ricard is in the front row. This was a very important occasion because it marked the change for the first time in roughly 400 or 500 years in the monastic curriculum in Gelug monasteries, where science was being formally incorporated into the monastic training. And so His Holiness wanted to showcase science at the monastery to, I think in part, expose the elder monks to the nature of this dialogue and to, I think, help the scientists appreciate the extraordinary context of these great monastic institutions as institutions of higher learning. And this meeting was attended by 10,000 monastics. This is the group of monastics that actually attended in person that meeting, which was really quite remarkable. So this is a little bit of an arc. Of course, very abbreviated, many things were left out, but a little bit of an arc of how this work has unfolded. And what I'd like to do in the first part of this talk is to name 5 specific themes upon which this work is founded. And this is the foundation that will then allow the work to go forward. It's the foundation upon which the work is built. And then from there, I will more explicitly talk about conflict and transformation. So what are these 5 themes that have enabled this work to go forward? Oh, one other thing. This is actually a photograph from the Department of Science in the Drepung Monastery of research that's being conducted there. And this is research looking at simultaneous brain activity of monastics who are engaged in debate. Some of you may be familiar with Tibetan debating. And it's quite physical. It's not something you can study with an MRI scanner, but it is something that potentially can be studied in this way. And so there's actually research underway now, not our research, but other scientists who are studying this, and really quite extraordinary to see how all this has evolved. Okay, so the 5 themes, and I'm going to go through some of these quickly, some I'll spend a little bit more time on. There are some themes that I'm sure all of you have heard of, some may be more novel. So the first theme I'm sure everyone has heard of, and that is simply neuroplasticity. And by neuroplasticity, we simply mean that the brain changes in response to experience and in response to training. The very mechanisms that produce suffering are the mechanisms that enable awakening. Plasticity happens wittingly or unwittingly. And plasticity is going on all the time. Our brains are constantly being shaped by the forces around us. And most of the time, we're unaware of those forces. And the invitation in all this work is that we can actually take more responsibility for the shaping of our own brains by transforming our minds. The second theme is the analog of neuroplasticity in the realm of genomics, and this is epigenetics. And epigenetics is the science of how genes are regulated. And although we are all born with a sequence of base pairs that constitute our DNA, and for the most part, that sequence will remain the same for the duration of our lives. What does change very dynamically is the extent to which genes are turned on or turned off. There are regulators on genes. You can think of them as little volume controls, and they are subject to tremendous variation and plasticity. And we know that adversity can impact epigenetics. We know that this begins very, very early in life. In fact, it begins inside the womb. And Susan and I have had many conversations about this. Many epigenetic marks are actually laid down during pregnancy. And there's more and more research which indicates that the emotional balance and demeanor of a mom, as well as the environmental exposures to which she is subjected, influence the epigenetic status of the fetus. And we can assess this in humans non-invasively by simply taking cord blood at the time of birth. And we can look at those cord blood samples which can tell us about the epigenetic state of the fetus at the time of birth, which reflects the cumulative duration of the prenatal exposure. And so there's really powerful evidence now that indicates that exposure to certain environmental pollutants, for example, during pregnancy, has a dramatic impact on epigenetics and gene expression for specific genes that are involved, for example, in neuroplasticity itself, neural growth factors, and so on. We also know that the emotional state during pregnancy can influence the epigenetic status of the fetus. And then this is also something that is regulated dynamically throughout life. And so we know that stress of various kinds in adulthood can induce epigenetic changes. And for the first time, we have evidence to show that meditation practice can actually induce epigenetic change and can induce it rapidly. Within a period of 6 to 8 hours, we can actually see evidence of epigenetic change. This has been published, and this is in hard-nosed mainstream scientific journals. Questions later. So the third theme is bidirectional communication between the mind and brain and the body. One of the beautiful things about our tradition, our practice, is it's a very embodied practice. And it's not a surprise, I think, to anyone in this group that our bodies play an important role in shaping our minds. And vice versa, our minds play a very important role in shaping our bodies. The communication is bidirectional. There is powerful epidemiological evidence that indicates that psychological well-being is associated with physical health. Higher levels of well-being are associated with better physical health outcomes. Now, that doesn't mean it happens in everyone. There are certainly always going to be exceptions, but if you look at tens of thousands of people, in epidemiological studies, this is an association that you find. The best data for this come from a classic series of studies done with British civil servants. And this is with very large sample sizes, and the data are very, very clear. We don't understand the mechanisms through which this occurs, but the fact of the association is very well established. And it leads to the possibility, to the invitation, that cultivating well-being may impact not simply our psychological well-being, but also our physical well-being, and also vice versa. So the fourth theme is one that we've talked about a little bit already over the course of the last few days, this notion of innate basic goodness. And this is so interesting and important because in the contemplative traditions, when we practice cultivating compassion and kindness, we are not creating these qualities de novo, but rather we're recognizing these qualities that exist already. These are qualities that are part of our basic nature. And this leads to a very different way of thinking about qualities like kindness and compassion. And the way we think of them is very much like scientists think of language. We all come into the world with a biological propensity for language. But that propensity is not expressed unless a person is raised in a normal linguistic community. And there are case studies of feral children who are raised in the wild who do not develop normal language. And it may be very similar with attributes like kindness and compassion, which require nurturing. So the fifth theme is one that is critical for understanding transformation, and it comes from behavioral science research, and that is the science of how we can create and maintain healthy habits. And this is something really, really important, because if we are going to change the world, we need to change our minds, transform our minds. And if we're going to transform our minds, we need to establish new or more enduring healthy habits. And how do we establish healthy habits? Well, there's a growing behavioral science literature that is relevant to this, and I'll just give you a couple of snippets, and this will lead into our discussion of conflict and transformation. So it turns out, amazingly, that if you ask a person to intentionally think of others rather than themselves, it can dramatically impact behavior. And so there are studies been done of personal hygiene in hospitals, having employees wash their hands. And if you have a communication campaign which says that washing your hands is helpful to others, you find an increased use of soap by 45% in very large sample size studies, simply by giving the instruction that you are doing this primarily to benefit others rather than yourself in all of the communications. So this is a way to change behavior in a beneficial way really quite quickly and dramatically. Translating intention into action. If you actually have a person write if-then statements, and a lot of this comes from the medical literature. If people have to take medication each day at a certain time, then they can write an if-then statement. If it's time and I'm in my bathroom, then I will take my medication. If you ask a person to write 3 if-then statements twice a day for 3 days, it increases their compliance to 79% from 55%. Actually verify compliance of taking medication. So very simple strategies to change behavior. Strategies that can be used to disrupt existing habits, and one of the most important is changing context. And I have here just a reminder to say something about procedural and declarative memory. How many of you have ever had the experience of driving where you, because of a route that you habitually take, you continue going on that route even though you meant to be going somewhere else? This is procedural memory, where you have this kind of action pattern encoded, and you have a declarative sense to override it, but it's very difficult to override those procedural memories. And so by shifting contexts, it can be very helpful to do that. And then the last bit that I'd like to just mention briefly is strategies to develop routines to create new habits, and just say one or two things about this. One is what we call piggybacking. And this is actually something that we are actively taking advantage of in some new work that we're doing, which I may have time to talk about later, but may not. And what piggybacking is simply piggybacking something onto an existing habit. And so if you are going to do a little bit of practice while you are engaged in another activity of daily living, you can piggyback it onto an activity of daily living. So you can say that if you brush your teeth at a certain time of day in the morning, that just after I brush my teeth, I'm going to do X. You piggyback this new behavior on another activity of daily living, and you do it very intentionally. Okay. So, in the beginning of practice periods, in the times that I've led here and that others have led our practice, we often talk about motivation and intention and invoking some sense of the view. What transformation, at least in part, depends on is taking the view, taking the motivation, taking the intention, and translating it into action. And so this is really a core element of transformation that I'd like to now unpack, and also talk about the role of conflict and how neuroscientists have approached conflict in this process. Okay. How many of you have heard of the Stroop task? Okay. So a few of you have. We're actually going to do a little experiment now. So if you can please put down your pencil and paper. And what I'd like for you to do is I'm going to flash a series of words on the screen, and I'd like for you to simply name the color of the word. Simply say out loud, all together, what color the word is that's being displayed. Okay?
As quickly as possible.
As quickly as possible. Everyone got it?
Your timing?
Okay.
Red, green, blue, green, yellow, blue, red, yellow, green.
Okay. So I just activated all of your anterior cingulate cortices. Every one of you. The anterior cingulate cortex. So, neuroscientists often have favorite parts of the brain. So, this is in my top 5. we've got a lot to choose from. So what is the anterior cingulate cortex, and what might it do? This is, on the lower left, is a sagittal image of the brain. So if I were to cut the brain right down the middle through the nose and open it up, and we can do this non-invasively with an MRI scanner, the areas that are colored constitute the anterior cingulate. And these are different sectors of the anterior cingulate. And this comes from a review which a group of us in our lab, wrote that was published a few years ago. And the first author at the time was a graduate student in our lab, Alex Shackman. And if you look at the cartoon image on the bottom right, there was a classical view that the anterior cingulate was divided into two major sectors. One was a so-called affective division, and another was a so-called cognitive division. And if we studied you folks in an MRI scanner and did what I just did, what the classical finding would be is that you would see activation more in the cognitive division of the anterior cingulate than in the affective division. And if you had a conflict that was more of an emotional conflict rather than a cognitive conflict, you would see activation more in the affective division. Now, it turns out there's a lot of theoretical implications of this division and a lot of important theoretical claims that ride on it, and also a lot of evidence related to this. And for a variety of reasons, we were not persuaded by this claim. And in part, we wrote this review to really put to rest this notion that there was a cognitive and an emotional division. And it's part of a more general strategy, and not just a strategy, but more of a trend, more empirical observation that is suggesting that the brain actually does not respect, does not honor the division between, quote, emotion and, quote, cognition. That is a category that we've imposed, and that nature does not seem to respect this division. And it's really interesting because one of the things that I've learned from hanging out with colleagues like John Dunn is that in Tibetan, there actually is no word for emotion. This is very much something that is a cultural product of our understanding, but our brains do not respect that division. And so what it means is, and every time we think that there's a part of the brain which is so-called cognitive and not emotional, when the right kinds of experiments are done, we see that emotional processes actually modulate activity in those brain areas. Even in areas that we thought were really immune to this, like, for example, area V1, which is in the back of our head. It's primary visual cortex. It's the very first relay station where visual information goes from the thalamus, which is a subcortical relay station. This is the first cortical place where visual information is sent. Even at V1, there is dramatic modulation of V1 with emotional processes. And so at every level of the nervous system where it's been examined carefully, we see this division completely falling apart. So if you look here, this was a meta-analysis that we did as part of this. Each dot that you see, each red dot in each of these sagittal sections of the brain, which is displaying activation in the anterior cingulate, this is with studies that are so-called purely cognitive. This is studies with pain, and this is studies with negative affect. And you don't need statistics to see that there's complete overlap. there is not any separation when you actually look carefully at the data. So this is an area of the brain which we neuroscientists talk about as having to do with some kind of conflict detection, conflict monitoring, conflict resolution. It seems to be activated by conflict. And I gave you one very simple sort of plain vanilla example of conflict. But in the emotional domain, what are some examples of everyday conflict that we run into all the time? Well, when you ask a person, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And you hear one thing in their tone of voice and then see a kind of smile, and you are exposed to discrepant input. Their voice may be telling you something different than their face. Their body posture may be communicating something different. That we can think of as a kind of affective conflict. Another kind of conflict is the conflict between an aspiration, an intention, and the status quo. That is the reality of who you are at the present moment in time. So we can invoke the vow of freeing numberless beings, and then we can inspect our own minds and see how we're doing in that vow. And that is another kind of conflict. And I would like to advance the suggestion that these are productive conflicts. They are, to use the language of RIchie Joan, they put us on the edge. And they activate certain brain circuits which may play an important role in initiating transformation. So that's a core of this suggestion. So it turns out that this region of anterior cingulate, which is where all this stuff comes together, and we called it in this paper the RCZ, it's the rostral cingulate zone, and these are projections to and from to many different parts of the brain, including the nucleus accumbens is an area in the striatum which is really important for certain kinds of motivation, for reward. The amygdala is part of a circuit that we think of as salience, really important in labeling things that are significant. The ventral tegmental area, these are areas, actually the next several, that are very important in certain kinds of threat responses that an organism might make. And the spinothalamic tract is where the intentions actually get translated into action when there actually is action that results from the resolution of a conflict in some way. Now, this is the amygdala at the center of this diagram. This is the amygdala. And every one of these lines is an anatomically verified connection. Every one of these lines, this is anatomically verified. And so this is just the amygdala. And I showed you that the anterior cingulate projects the amygdala. And then from the amygdala, we see this massive hub of projections to so many different areas of the brain. And I'll just point out one or two of these. Remember I told you about V1, primary visual cortex. This is V1. There is a direct monosynaptic connection between the amygdala and V1. And this is the connection that enables the modulation of the most basic visual sensory processes by our emotional state. And so when something is labeled by the amygdala to be more salient, it will modulate activity in V1. Really quite extraordinary how the system is wired. And then up here, areas 24, 25, and area 46, those are areas in the prefrontal cortex. And there are also direct connections between the amygdala and these regions of prefrontal cortex, which enable the amygdala to modulate decision-making and planning, but also enable the prefrontal cortex to modulate activity in the amygdala. So this is just one teeny piece of this overall circuitry. And so this is just reflecting these massive interconnections through which the anterior cingulate, when conflict is detected and this area of the brain gets engaged, there are signals that just project to so many different places to enable us to deal with, to adjudicate, to in some way resolve or act upon this conflict that is being detected. Okay, so I want to just sort of give a couple of illustrations of how this region of the brain has been studied and why it figures importantly in certain kinds of research. The engagement of this circuit we can think of as in part being associated with a quality or a construct that has not been talked about a lot in the modern psychological literature, but William James talked about it quite a bit, and it's called will. Part of the capacity for transformation is the will to transform. If we don't have the will to transform, transformation is going to be much less likely to occur. And we can think of the anterior cingulate as being part of a hub which, at least in part, reflects this will to transform. And if you have more activity in this area, there should be more will to transform, and so strategies for transformation should be more effective. And so let me just give you a couple of examples. It turns out that the literal volume in cubic millimeters of the anterior cingulate cortex predicts how well a depressed patient does in response to cognitive therapy. Those patients whose anterior cingulates are bigger actually do better in response to cognitive therapy. And so the suggestion here is these are people who, for whatever reason, and we can talk about that later, probably both, extraordinarily complicated reasons. For whatever those reasons are, they have larger anterior cingulates and they are able to change more in response to cognitive therapy. This is another example of that. So one of the really crazy things in modern psychiatric research is that there are studies that drug companies do to evaluate the impact of pharmaceuticals for various psychiatric conditions. And when they do these studies, they do what they typically call a placebo run-in. And what a placebo run-in is that they'll give a placebo to a group of patients, and if they find that patients respond a lot to the placebo, they drop them from the study. It actually turns out that this is something extremely important and powerful, and the noise in their study is really the signal in our studies. And so it turns out that when you study this, patients who have increased connectivity, in this case, between the anterior cingulate and other parts of the network that we call the salience network. And here, this area, this is in what we call a coronal section of the brain. And this area is the insula, which is another part of the salience network in addition to the amygdala. And what it shows is that patients who have greater connectivity between these regions, suggesting that this is a circuit more engaged, are showing a bigger placebo response. they're actually showing more change in response to a placebo. And so these, again, are individuals you can think of as having a greater will to change. This circuit is more engaged to begin with, and the likelihood of transformation is greater. So one of the unfortunate things in the modern scientific literature is that conflict processing, as we call it, has been pretty much subsumed under the rubric of negative affect. And so this is just an influential paper that was published just a couple of years ago, and it talks about cognitive conflict, and basically it has all this stuff associated with negative affect. So anxiety, frustration, avoidance, facial expressions of frowning, and it is very much an assumption that conflict is always going to be negative. And can we envision another possibility? Can we envision the kind of productive edge states that we can think of as inducing a healthy kind of conflict? The conflict between, for example, our aspiration, a vow that we may take, and the current state of our being, as a way to activate transformation so that we progressively come closer to our aspiration. And so that's really the invitation and a suggestion to take this work and kind of turn it around and suggest that there may be other ways of thinking about this. So this was a paper that was published quite a few years ago now in Science, and it's a paper that's, the title of it is Attention to Intention. And so this is really important because the suggestion here is that we can strengthen our intention by bringing attention to intention. And when we invoke an aspiration, when we take a vow, if we imbue it with greater attention, we can strengthen the intention. And it turns out that when we do that experimentally, you actually see systematic changes in the brain. And it's really amazing to be able to track this stuff. This is functional MRI, and the yellow is a intention-enhanced response it turns out in a motor region of the brain, but it's generated initially in the anterior cingulate, and it is enhanced through an explicit intention. And using a combination of EEG and fMRI in this study, which is really one of the first studies to do it, they found that it was the signals in the anterior cingulate here that preceded a response up to 700 milliseconds, 3/4 of a second earlier, when there was an explicit intention, this was a simple intention to move, and the intention was strengthened by attention. And so when we engage in the kind of practice that we do, and we strengthen our intentions with clarity that we bring from the practice, we can actually strengthen the role of the anterior cingulate in this way, and potentially enable the more productive use of this kind of conflict, the conflict that arises from the discrepancy between the aspiration that we hold and the status quo of the present moment. So, so this is really just what I've talked about. And one issue here is the importance, that I say, of letting it bother us. Letting it bother us, turning towards suffering, and allowing that conflict, if you will, to be able to rest in it. And by resting in it, we can enhance the discrepancy, if you will, between the present state and the aspiration, and that can actually trigger a transformational response. One of the studies that's relevant to this, this is something that actually just was published online about 6 days ago, that came from our group. The first author is Helen Wang, who's now an assistant professor at the University of California, San Francisco, and she did this work when she was in our lab. And what we did in this study is simple compassion training. And the way we studied it is by exposing people to visual images of suffering. And one of the things that we did is we monitored very carefully the frequency and duration of a person's eye movements toward the specific parts of the image that were the most salient in depicting suffering. And what we found is that when people first started, before they did any training, the classical response when you present an image of this kind is for people to avert their gaze. They don't want to look at it. And after just 2 weeks of compassion training, they spent significantly more time actually looking at these images. And at the same time, they showed reductions in arousal in certain brain areas that, like the amygdala, that may be counterproductive if they're overactivated. And so I think that there's something important here about letting it bother us and resting in this, which can activate this whole cascade of circuits that we're beginning to learn about in the brain that can initiate this process of transformation. So attention or awareness, in this case, can be an amplifier of intention. We can amplify intentions through awareness. And there are many ways of doing this, and one of the ways that many of us do this is we have pictures of our teachers that remind us. We have important quotes that we put up to remind us. These are all ways of amplifying intention. And they're potentially very useful in strengthening these circuits. So that's arranging our environment to provide supports. So enduring and genuine well-being includes decreases in implicit bias, decreases in othering, increases in the embodiment of interconnection, all of which can be productively addressed by resting in these edge states, which are really states of a certain kind of conflict, which is associated with all this circuitry that I've talked about, that can then be the catalyst for various kinds of transformation. So it's now 10 o'clock, and there's a whole other section which I'm going to skip, which is about well-being as an urgent public health need. But it's really okay. Really, it's okay. And I want to just end. You can get that from other stuff. So this is Mingyur Rinpoche during his retreat. And I want to end with a short passage from Mingyur Rinpoche from his book, The Joy of Living. And it is a book that I recommend to many people as, I think, one of the most accessible introductions to meditation that really is accessible to anyone from any tradition. And he said, at any given moment, you can choose to follow the chain of thoughts, emotions, and sensations that reinforce a perception of yourself as vulnerable and limited, or to remember that your true nature is pure, unconditioned, and incapable of being harmed. You can remain in the sleep of ignorance, or remember that you are and always have been awake. Thank you very much.
So we will take the shorter the break, the more time we'll have for some Q&A and discussion. But I know the body calls, so try to come back. If it's possible to come back in 10 minutes, that would be wonderful.